Welcome back to Peer-Guided DBT Lessons, provided by DBT Skills Application, Peers Helping Peers. This week's lesson, marked 2-2 in our Distress Tolerance module, we'll be looking at pros and cons. Please keep in mind that we're simply peers helping peers, working together to bring about more peaceful, constructive, and ultimately happier lives. In other words, a life worth living. To tolerate or not to tolerate. A person's automatic reaction to distress is to do something to alleviate suffering. This urge to respond with an impulsive behavior may even be extremely strong for a person who experiences uncomfortable emotions as unbearable, with an overwhelming compulsion to make them go away. Even though some of our impulses have seemed to work in the short term by giving us temporary reduction in our distress, in the long run they can actually make it worse. Responding to these impulsive urges is a very unhealthy way to deal with strong emotions. If a person's natural urge is to do whatever it takes to make or reduce their current distress, even if only as a short-term solution, and responding to impulsive urges of this type is an unhealthy way to deal with distress, how do we get past that urge? How do we decide to respond to it in the most effective, helpful manner? This week we're going to be looking at pros and cons. People use pros and cons on a daily basis, although in most cases it is on a subconscious level. Throughout the day, we go through our invisible pros and cons on many different possible behavioral choices. Should we brush our teeth today? Why or why not? Should we go to the bathroom right now? Why or why not? If you think about some of these pros and cons we take for granted, we can see the behind-the-scenes reasoning for the mundane, daily decisions we make. We can expand this natural skill to include a conscious consideration of using and practicing this skill to weigh the pros and cons of tolerating the emotions when we are feeling distressed. So let's take a look at the simple pros and cons to brush or not to brush our teeth. The pros might be nicer looking teeth, fresher breath, dentist visits for only cleaning, less likely to lose teeth. And the cons might be dingy teeth, bad breath, dentist visits for painful treatments, more likely to lose teeth, have to use the time and the energy. The end goal of the distress tolerance pro-con process is allowing yourself to work out and understand that the pros of tolerating a situation far outweigh the pros of not tolerating it. This can best be made clear by listing them and comparing them. A pros and cons worksheet or list to decide the cost and benefits of tolerating distress are a bit different than the typical pro-con list used to evaluate the pros and cons of doing something versus not doing something. Our first example here shows the pros and cons of not tolerating distress. On the one side of pros, we have an escape from distressing emotions and less short-term pain. And the cons of not tolerating distress might be we don't learn the ability to tolerate distress, and there is an increase of avoidance. Dialects of DBT teaches that nothing is totally black and white. There can be good and bad in either of your choices, to tolerate distress or not to tolerate distress. With this pro-con exercise, we want to evaluate them fully from every perspective. Because there are both pros in not tolerating distress and pros in tolerating distress, We could choose to focus on the pros of not tolerating when they stand alone, with only the pros of tolerating to weigh in against. Our next example here shows the pros of tolerating distress versus the pros of not tolerating distress. The pros of tolerating distress might be we learn to cope with distress, and there is a decrease in avoidance. And the pros of tolerating distress would be there's an escape from distressing emotions and less short-term pain. Now let's take a look at the Foursquare of pros and cons. This exercise, laid out in a Foursquare rather than the typical two-square pros and cons, gives us a much clearer picture of how either decision will impact us. When we lay our pro-con list out with both the pros and cons of tolerating distress and the pros and cons of not tolerating distress, we get a much better idea of which decision is wisest for us. Another way to look at tolerating distress. What would you do if you choose not to tolerate the distress? What urge does this type of distress trigger in you? What would you do to escape the distress? To tolerate distress means to survive without making it worse. To not tolerate distress means to attempt to escape in a way that adds to the problem. Now let's take a look at Foursquare Pros and Cons Part 1 worksheets. You can choose to use our worksheet number 1, or if using your own, draw a line down the center of a piece of paper. At the top of the page, add the title, Tolerating Distress. Then name the emotion that could stress you enough to cause a crisis reaction, and the problem behavior you would have the urge to do. Then under that, label the first column pros and the second column cons. List everything you can think of for both the pros and the cons in both columns. Then, take a break between this sheet and the next one. Put this list away or turn it over before proceeding. Next, take out our worksheet number 2, or, if making your own, draw a line down the center of a piece of paper. At the top of the page, add the title, Not Tolerating Distress. Then name the emotion that could stress you enough to cause a crisis reaction and the problem behavior you would have the urge to do. Under that, label the first column pros and the second column cons. Then list everything you can think of for both the pros and the cons in both columns, without looking at the answers from your first sheet. The next step is we want to make it generic. It's important to note that we're not looking for the situation that caused the distress. We are looking for how we act on the distress we are feeling. If we feel distress, no matter the cause, if we engage in impulsive, damaging behaviors, we are not tolerating our distress. Instead of focusing on the situation, it would be more helpful to consider how you react as a means of avoiding or escaping different distressing emotions. For example, when I am distressed and feeling angry, I would most likely, and then fill in the blank. When I am distressed and feeling anxious, I would most likely fill in the blank. When I am distressed and feeling depressed, I would most likely. When I am distressed and feeling afraid, I would most likely, and then fill in the blank. We need to look over both of our lists and reword them so that they are not specific for a situation, but can be used generically for the distressing emotion and triggered urge. Now on to part 2, rank listed options. Once you've listed every possible result that you can think of, both benefits and costs, you'll then carefully consider each of your lists. On your tolerating distress list, carefully weigh each of your answers. Consider for each of them how important each one of these is to you. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most helpful of the pros, rate the importance value of each. Number 1, not really important. Number 2, not too important. Number 3, somewhat important. Number 4, important. And number 5, very important. Some ranking examples. If one of your tolerating distress con answers was, acting on this urge could be life-threatening. Let's say, for example, your third answer. That would be rated a 5. If one of your tolerating distress con answers was, I would lose an hour of sleep, let's say your first answer, that might be rated a 2. Next, repeat this process on your not tolerating distress pro-con list. Carefully weigh each of your answers. Consider for each of them how important each one of these is to you. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most helpful of the pros, rate the importance value of each. Again, 1, not really important. 2, not too important. 3, somewhat important. 4, important. And 5, very important. Next is adding the columns. At this point, I will add the sums of both my pro column and my con column. The totals, when compared, should show me which behavior is best for me and in keeping with my values. This will be demonstrated with our example PDF, page 7. I will repeat with my second worksheet, adding the sums of both my pro column and my con column. The totals, when compared, should show me which behavior is best for me and in keeping with my values. This will be demonstrated with our example PDF, page 9. Now let's do some adding. To start with, let's do the sum in favor of tolerating distress. We do this by adding the totals from the tolerating distress worksheet pro list to the totals from the not tolerating distress worksheet con list. Both show the value placed on the benefits of tolerating distress. Next, let's do the sum in favor of not tolerating distress. We do this by adding the totals from the not tolerating distress worksheet pro list to the totals from the tolerating distress worksheet con list. Both show the value placed on the benefits of not tolerating distress, following through with an urge. These totals alone should show us how much more we value learning the skills to tolerate distress rather than act out on a crisis behavior urge. If not convinced yet, the next part of the lesson will make it even clearer. Now on to part 3, transfer and organize. This will be a reminder that you will carry around with you, so you want to make this as neat as possible. You can use our worksheet number 3, or if creating your own, start by drawing a rectangle on the page, leaving room to write above, below, and to the left of it. Divide this into 4 equal parts, then divide each of these in half. This will leave you with 8 equal sections. Now this part is already filled out on our PDF worksheet number 3 for your convenience, but if you're creating your own, you'll want to write in the following elements above the rectangle: distress tolerance, and under that, distressing emotion, and escape urge, and then pros and cons. Next, if creating your own, you'll want to write in the following elements to the left of the rectangle: Not to tolerate distress, short-term and long-term, and to tolerate distress, short-term and long-term. Next, if creating your own, you're going to want to write in the following elements below the rectangle. To tolerate rating, not to tolerate rating. Long-term consequences, long-term consequences. Short-term consequences, short-term consequences. And skills to use. You can find a link to our store for these worksheets, as well as our lesson and example PDFs in the video description below. Continuing with Part 3, now that we are prepared with our pro-con reminder sheet, we're ready to transfer and organize. At the top, you'll want to fill in the line asking for the emotion causing the distress. And then you want to fill in the line asking for the escape urge. Next, we will transfer our pros and cons from our worksheets over to our reminder sheet. As we transfer each point, we want to list them according to value rating with the most important points first. Also, we want to list each point according to the time frame the results of our decisions will continue to affect us. Some repercussions are short-lived, while others can affect us for a long time to come. This will be the completed production. We want to attempt to make this sheet as neat as possible, since we're going to be carrying this with us everywhere we go, as a reminder of my priorities should you face this type of distressing situation in the future. Beginning with worksheet number 1, we will be transferring everything from our Tolerating Distress worksheet over to the reminder sheet. Putting our Tolerating Distress Pro list on the To Tolerate Distress Pro list on the reminder sheet, then the cons to the cons. Going back to our example that was used in our previous demonstration, example PDF page 7, we will search our list for our highest rated point, which in this example is a 5. We will then determine if this predicted result is likely to be short-lived or a long-lasting result. In this case, it would be a long-term consequence. Respect lost is hard to rebuild. We will then add it to the appropriate section of our reminder sheet. We repeat this process with the next highest, the first 4. Then the next 4. And the next 4. When we reach the next item that is rated as a 4, we will put this in the short-term sections because this refers to a feeling, and feelings are short-lived. We will repeat this process with those rated as a 3. The first one we rated 3, we will also place in the short-term section. A scene is short-lived, even if the results could be longer-lasting. Short-term for the next 3. And the next 3. The final point rated a 3 would go in the long-term section. Now on to part 4, ranking totals. Once our pros and cons have been transferred over, the next step is to fill in the sum totals of our rating values at the bottom of the page. This will give us the final ranking of importance to us. First, fill in the totals found earlier for to tolerate, some in favor of tolerating distress, and not to tolerate, some in favor of not tolerating distress. We will then fill in our totals for our long-term consequences in favor of tolerating distress. To demonstrate this, we will use the totals from our PDF example. We will add the totals from the tolerating distress list, pro long-term list, to the totals from the not tolerating distress list, con long-term list. Both of these show the value placed on the benefits of tolerating distress, long-term. We will then fill in our totals for our short-term consequences in favor of tolerating distress. We will add the totals from the tolerating distress list, pro short-term list, to the totals from the not tolerating distress list, con short-term list. Both of these show the value placed on the benefits of tolerating distress, short-term. Next, we will fill in our totals for our long-term consequences in favor of not tolerating distress, following our urge. We will add the totals from the not tolerating distress list, pro long-term list, to the totals from the tolerating distress list, con long-term list. Both of these show the value placed on the benefits of not tolerating distress. Next, we'll then fill in our totals for our short-term consequences in favor of not tolerating distress, following our urge. We will add the totals from the not tolerating distress list, pro short-term list, to the totals from the tolerating distress list, con short-term list. Both of these show the value placed on the benefits of not tolerating distress. It is important to remember that we're creatures of free will, and at times, even knowing the consequences of an action, this will not deter us from still taking an unwise action. Evaluating the pros and cons for short-term consequences and long-term consequences should help convince the willfulness in us. The only way we can choose to not tolerate distress is by choosing to do something that might make us feel better, for the moment, short-term, but could create a lot more problems for us in the long run, long-term. Remember when we looked at the pros and cons of brushing our teeth? The reason you choose not to do what is best for you is usually the least important reason with the shortest term consequences. Okay, let's get real here. I'm not going to kid you. It can be challenging while going through it to focus on surviving and tolerating distress. But keep in mind what your goal is. Focus on your long-term dreams. Imagine how wonderful it will feel when you don't act impulsively and move a step towards achieving your goals. Keep your focus on the light at the end of the tunnel. Be sure to check out the video description in the comments below. You'll find a link to the website lesson that accompanies this video. You will also find links to the handouts and worksheets created to complement this video. And while you're there, if you found this video helpful, be sure to like it. Next week in our peer-guided DBT Lessons to Stress Tolerance module, we'll be looking at tip skills. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel where our entire DBT course is now available. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time. Bye for now.